Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
One Piece Straw Hat Family by Hotspot the 626th. As the crew travels through the Grand Line, something happens that not even the crew could prepare for. A baby? What are the Straw Hats going to do? Abbas, I don't own anything. Adios.
Monkey D. Star: The Wonderful Life and Untimely Death of Luffy's Mother. In the time of young Luffy's childhood many years ago, before meeting his brothers and even before meeting Shanks, he lived as a small child with his mother, Monkey D. Star in the East Blue. Here, Luffy and his mother lived in relative peace and joy, enjoying each and every day. Of course, as a young man, he would only barely recall this time in his life. He nevertheless considered it precious. But out of all the memories that he would keep of his young life, this one memory would stand out throughout his life like a scar upon his heart. On Dawn Island, in the midst of spring, there lies Windmill Village. This peaceful town was going about their daily activities. Collecting groceries, repairing damages, tending to the fields, out fishing, and much more. As it was a small village, there were hardly any crowds and dirt streets that made up. That did not mean that it wasn't busy. Currently in the streets were two young and beautiful women conversing and walking, one of whom was carrying some bags full of food. One had dark green hair, was a tad shorter than the woman she was happily conversing with. The other woman who was carrying the bags had long, messy, black hair.
Did Luffy really do that? Asked the young woman, surprised.
The other woman snickered. He did, Makino, and I couldn't believe it, she said, grinning with pride. He got the whole troop of monkeys to follow him around. It was so cute. The woman, Makino, giggled lightly. That son of yours, Star, she said, amused. He does the most incredible things. So, how did you get the monkeys to leave? Well, Star said as she raised her hand up, making a fist, and grinning with confidence. I just laid down the law of the jungle. Immediately, Makino began laughing. As much as the feats of her son were impressive, the woman she had known for her whole life was still just as or more so impressive. Eventually, Star began laughing with her younger friend. These two women were enjoying their conversation greatly. That is, until Star's laughter quickly turned into a rough and hoarse cough. While the black-haired woman quickly covered her mouth, Makino stopped laughing and looked at the older woman with great concern and worry. Star, Makino said with a frown, that cough sounds worse than it was last week. As her coughing began settling down, Star replied back to her friend. I'm okay. Really, she said with a smile. Makino wasn't convinced, however. That's what you said when you had gotten sap stuck in your hair when we were kids. You tried getting it out, but made it worse. In the end, you had to get most of your hair cut by Mayor Whoop Slap. Star chuckled with nostalgia. Yeah, not one of my best ideas. Her expression then turned serious as she spoke to her friend, but really, I'm fine, little sis. Please, Makino said to the woman, sounding urgent. Go to the doctor, if not for my sake but for Luffy's sake. The older woman stopped walking upon hearing the request. Her brow began to furrow as she felt slightly conflicted. After moments of contemplation, Star released a sigh. All right, I'll go to the doctor, she said, sounding almost as if she had been defeated. Surprisingly, Makino was still not convinced. Do you promise to see the doctor today? She asked sternly. Why yes, Star said, almost slightly afraid of the shorter woman. Makino then smiled. Good, but, Star suddenly said in addition, only after I take care of lunch for Luffy. The green-haired woman nodded. Okay, she said calmly. Though she still had her concerns, she didn't feel like a small divergent would do any harm. Stat immediately grinned. Good, she said happily. She then kept walking again while Makino stayed on the edge of the village. While Makino watched her friend travel down the road, a man came walking up from behind her. He was a small man, middle-aged at best, wearing oval glasses. This was Whoop Slap, the mayor of Windmill Village, and as he walked up next to Makino, the expression on his face showed a great amount of concern. Is Star still neglecting her health? He asked openly for Makino to hear. Sadly, Makino nodded. Yes, she said, but I made her promise me this time, especially since I mentioned it was for Luffy's sake. Immediately, Whoop Slap began frowning with displeasure. That girl, always making me worry about her. When she ran off to get that plant from the mountain in winter, I nearly had a heart attack seeing all her wounds. The young woman frowned as she too remembered that day.
The young boy is severely sick. I've got a few remedies, but without that flower I'm afraid the boy will die. I'll get the flower, Doc. Just take care of my son.
Star, what happened to you? You're cut and bruised.
Makino, I got it. She's still the same reckless and stubborn girl even after all these years. Whoop Slap continued saying, crotchety and displeased. The green-haired shook her head. No, I think she's a little different. Makino said, smiling optimistically. After all, she's married now, and has Luffy to take care of.
Even though it was a disagreement, the man couldn't help but agree slightly with the young woman's statement. Yeah, I guess so. He said, sounding almost a little proud. At least that girl learned some responsibility when she met Garp's son. Makino nodded in agreement, smiling fondly. In her head, memories of a certain time in her life played out like it was only yesterday. Hey, Garp's son, a much younger, probably in her teens, Star shouted loudly towards a young man in the village. This Star was covered in few cuts, bruises, and with dirt all over her body as if she had tussled with an animal. Her hair was even wilder than it would be presently. Before Star was a young man with a serious and stern expression with short black hair. He stood surrounded by a crowd along with Star by the many citizens of Windmill Village. Among them was younger versions of Garp, Whoop Slap, and even Dayton. She and her gang were among the crowd. Garp, wearing a Hawaiian shirt, looked to be amused by the display. Standing in front of the young Whoop Slap was an even younger Makino, probably a child, as she watched on in amazement. "What do you want, girl?" replied the male teen annoyed. Star grinned as she raised up her fists. "Fight me," she said determinedly. Returning back to the present, Star was walking alone towards a lone house on the edge of the forest. As she walked closer to the house, her house, she caught sight of a little figure running around in the yard. A child, her child. She smiled brightly as she spied her son having fun on some adventure he made up to entertain himself. He looked to having so much fun, she hated to interrupt his fun. Luckily, as the boy turned around, preparing to throw a punch, he spotted her. Instantly, he began beaming brightly. "Mommy!" Luffy shouted happily before stopping everything and running at his mother. Star smiled and stopped walking. As her son came running at her, she bent down and held her arms out towards the boy. She then caught the boy and gave him a great big hug. "Luffy," she said happily. Luffy laughed as he hugged his mother back. Soon though, the boy spoke again, this time bluntly. "I'm hungry, mommy." Immediately, Star laughed out. "Of course you are, my hungry, little monkey," she said before holding up her grocery bag smiling. "Look what I got." The little boy gasped as he instantly recognized what was in the bag. "Meat," he cheered out as he threw his hands and arms up. "Meat, meat, meat." Again, Star laughed. All right, she said as she stood back up. "Let's get inside so you can eat." Yay! The young mother and her son went inside the home. Inside, it was simple setup for the family of two. The house only had one room, which was practically every room: bedroom, kitchen, dining room, living room, and everything else except a bathroom. That luckily was outside behind the house by the forest. There wasn't much furniture either, just what was necessary. There weren't even that to play with. And yet, neither one had any issue with how minimal they lived, for they got by well enough. Inside, Star began cooking up most of the food she had already acquired. As she did this, young Luffy waited in the only way he could. Impatiently and constantly in motion. The little boy simply ran around the room just laughing and amusing himself. Star was careful not to accidentally run into her excited son as she cooked with gusto. In a few minutes, she was done cooking. Instantly, Luffy stopped his running and hopped into his seat. After setting the food on the table, mostly meat with a few cooked vegetables, Star joined him at the table. Just as the eager young boy was about to dig into his meal, Star lightly slapped the boy's wrist. "Luffy," Star said, being lightly stern, "before eating we must give thanks." "Oh yeah," the young boy said, smiling unashamed. He then put his hands together and chanted out, "Thank you for the food." Star mirrored the same hand gesture. "Thank you for the food," she said softly. They both then began eating. While Star ate with the grace of a lady at a tea party, her son was completely the opposite. The little boy gobbled down food like this would be his last meal. He loved the meals his mother prepared, proudly proclaiming to anyone that his mother was the best cook in the world. Always, Star was flattered. As the two ate their meal, Star soon recalled the promise she made to her friend. So, almost begrudgingly, she informed Luffy of her plans. "Luffy sweetie," the young boy stopped eating and looked at his mother with food in his mouth. "Yeah? Mommy has to go into the village again." Luffy swallowed his food. "Why? Are you gonna get more food?" "No," Star said, stifling a chuckle, "but Ms. Makino thinks your mother is sick, so she made me promise to visit the doctor." "But you're not sick, Mommy," Luffy stated matter-of-factly. Star laughed softly. "I know, but Ms. Makino is very much a worrywart when it comes to my health. If it puts her mind at ease, I don't mind going to the doctor." Though his mother seemed okay with it, Luffy did not, evident by his sad frown. "But I wanted you to play with me after lunch."
Immediately, Star felt guilty seeing her son from frowning. "All right," she said with a smile. "I'll play with you for a little while, but then I will have to go to the doctor's."
"Yay!" cheered Luffy happily. The boy then went back to eating, knowing his precious mother was going to play with him. When they were down, and the dishes all cleaned up, mother and son went outside to play. The boy didn't have much to play with, but a simple ball was more than enough. For the most part, they just played catch. Though for Luffy, it was more a chance to show off his fighting prowess. "Pistol punch!" Luffy shouted excitedly as he threw his punch. Unfortunately, He missed completely and it caused the boy to fall forward. The boy recovered quickly, but he looked mad. "Stupid ball," he said, glaring at the ball angrily. Star giggled seeing her son. "Try again, sweetie," she called back, supportive. Determined, Luffy got back up. "Okay," he shouted, grinning with determination. He picked up the ball and threw it back to his mother. He then got ready to throw another punch by spinning his arm. "Throw it, mommy," he shouted, ready.
Okay, Star said with the ball in her hands. She then tossed the ball softly towards the boy, excited to see her son hit the ball.
Unfortunately, her happiness would not last long. Suddenly, Star felt her entire body convulse and she began coughing hard. Her breath seemed to shorten like she had been climbing a mountain. Her vision began to blur as she watched the ball head to her son. Then, all at once, her legs gave in. She fell and landed hard on the ground, still coughing hard.
Luffy didn't notice his mother as he was focused on the ball. As the ball neared him, he let forth a punch and hit the ball. "Pistol punch," shouted Luffy overjoyed. He had finally hit the ball. Though the ball only landed just a few feet away, the boy was nonetheless happy over his accomplishment.
"Mommy, did you see? Did you see? I did it, did you?" Though Luffy was excited, he soon noticed his mother on the ground. He was confused, so he walked up to her cautiously. Mommy?" He spoke confused. Star only responded with a violent cough. "Mommy!" Luffy shouted as he ran over to his mother's side. He began shaking her and he shouted out, confused. "What's wrong with you? What should I do, mommy?" Sensing her son's dismay, Star tried replying to him but could not. Her coughing was far too violent for her to allow her to speak. Still, she tried her best. "Lu," she coughed, unable to say his name. "J, cough, cough, Makino." The little boy hardly understood what his mother said. When he heard the name, Makino, though, it immediately snapped into his mind. He took off immediately with town and Makino in mind. As he ran, his mind was filled with the worst possible thoughts. These terrible thoughts began making him shed tears as well as making him run faster to the village. It wasn't long when Luffy entered the village, and though he had yet to find Makino, he began shouting out, "Help! Help!" As Luffy repeated the same word over and over, each time more emotional and louder. People began looking out their windows and doors wondering who was shouting. As he ran further into the village, more and more people were brought out. All of them grew concerned as they noticed it was Luffy making all the noise. "What's going on? Is that Luffy? What is he shouting about?
Why is he calling for help?" These questions drew in the people as they began to slowly follow behind the boy.
The poor young man didn't notice the crowd forming behind him as he looked for Makino. He was beginning to panic, having yet to find her. He would find, though, unknown to him, that he was soon coming up on Party's bar. He could see the mayor, Whoop Slap, sitting on the front porch of the bar just as Makino walked out with a drink for him. Immediately, Luffy called out as loud as he could. "Help!" The boy's shout instantly grabbed the two adults' attention, and gasped seeing the crying, panicking little boy. Immediately, Makino dropped what she was doing and ran over to meet the boy. "Luffy," she called out, worried, "what's wrong?" Luffy stopped and tried to tell the woman of the problem. Unfortunately, he was too sad and confused to speak regularly. Luckily, Makino didn't need the boy to explain. Just by recognizing the agony and pain on the boy's face was enough to give the woman a good idea what may have happened. She immediately took off down the road towards where Luffy came from. The boy quickly followed. As they ran, Makino yelled back down the street to the mayor urgently. "Mayor, get the doctor." Whoop Slap was surprised, but that didn't stop him from taking action. "You lot?" he shouted at one part of the crowd. "Go get the doctor and bring him to Star's home, on the double." "Why, Mayor?" asked one of the male villagers, shocked and confused. Whoop Slap growled at the crowd's ignorance. "I don't have time to explain," he shouted. "Star probably needs help now, get going." After being shouted again, the villagers didn't ask a follow-up question. Immediately, they moved to get the doctor. Though, this left another half of the crowd confused and now slowly becoming concerned. "What's happening, Mayor?" asked one of the female villagers. "There's no time," Whoop Slap replied as he began moving and heading down the street as quickly as he could. "Star needs us." That was enough to convince the crowd that something was indeed wrong. In light of this half of the crowd followed Whoop Slap, carrying him even as they were faster, down the road. All the while, he shouted at furiously for behaving so rudely to him. By later in the day, the whole Windmill Village was gathered around Star and Luffy's home. They all stood around, some looking inside the windows of the home, as they waited for news of any kind. Just outside the front door, Luffy w a few villagers the best they could. Unfortunately, despite their best efforts and good intentions, the little boy was far too worried to accept any of it. He just stared at the door to his home waiting for something to happen. Good or bad, he didn't know. Inside the home, Star was being tended to by the doctor from village as well as from Makino and Whoop Slap. Star herself was currently lying in bed, looking solemn and emotionless. On the other hand, Makino and Whoop Slap were looking shocked at the doctor. The doctor himself looked grim. "Doctor," Makino spoke, her voicing cracking from sadness and shock. "What you're saying, you can't mean that." "Unfortunately, it's true," the doctor said solemnly. "Miss Star is very sick, too sick to be cured. She is dying." Makino's eyes widened as the news sunk in. "No," she said in a shaky voice. "How could this have happened?" Whoop Slap said, baffled. "Her symptoms were relatively light until recently. Anyone would have mistaken it for a small cold. She must have caught this disease when she went up onto the mountain in the winter. I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do." "Don't tell us that," Makino shouted in anger, surprising everyone in the room, even Star. The young woman was so full of rage, sadness, and heartbreak she couldn't contain it. Makino," Whoop Slap said in shock. The young woman, still enraged and shedding tears, pointed towards the door. "You apologize to Luffy. That boy is going to lose his mother. How do you think he'll feel knowing that he will lose his mother already in his young life? At that moment, Makino completely broke down. She began crying into her hands as the full weight of this event took its toll on her. Though she was truly concerned for Luffy, just as he was going to lose his mother, she was going to lose her dear friend and big sister figure. This was too much for her, and all too soon as well. Both the doctor and Whoop Slap pitied the poor woman. Death is never an easy thing to accept, especially when it was someone close to you. Neither men spoke to her in fear that they may just put her in an emotional worst situation. That, however, did not stop the other adult from acting. Both men saw Star walk past them, and immediately they gasped. Star?" Whoop Slap called out in shock. Makino heard the man's shout and looked up. Before she could even react, Star had already wrapped her into a hug. Makino was completely caught off guard in shock. "Star." "I'm sorry, little sis," Makino said warmly with a sad smile. "I should have listened to you sooner. I could have spared you this sadness." The young woman whimpered before she hugged the woman back. Makino continued crying, though now into the woman's shoulder. Star did nothing to stop her and provided the younger woman with comfort. Whoop Slap watched on, slightly comforted as well by the sight. Unfortunately, he understood that there was still more misfortune to come. He turned to the doctor as he asked a gruesome question: "How long does she have left?" 3 days, at most." Of course, Makino overheard this. She began clutching onto Star's clothes as she was overcome with more sadness. Though Star still attempted to comfort her friend, she herself was beginning to shake a little. Her own situation was starting to get to her as well. "Makino," Star spoke softly and almost heartbroken. Can I ask you something?" The green-haired woman looked up from Star's shoulder. She was still crying, but she had become calm enough to respond slightly. Seeing Makino's face, Star smiled. "Could you take care of Luffy for me?" she said as her voice began seeping with sadness. Before speaking again, the woman herself was beginning to shed her own tears. "He's going to need someone to look after him when I'm—" Star couldn't complete her sentence. She had become completely engulfed in her own sadness, knowing that she could no longer watch her son grow up. That she could no longer be a part of the lives of all those she cared deeply for. All of this overwhelmed her usual strong character. She began crying just as her did, letting out her sadness and despair. Makino, seeing her friend cry, began crying a fresh wave of tears. Soon, she and Star were crying together. Both men in the room remained silent. It was their way of showing sadness while not interrupting the support of two dear friends. Watching through the windows, none of the villagers needed to hear what was going on. They all saw the emotions of both women and already guessed at the worst. The news traveled fast among the crowd. "Did you see? That poor woman. That's bad news if I've ever seen one. What's going to happen to Luffy?" Unfortunately, large crowds never seem to have any sense of tact. As the news spread from person to person, their voices eventually reached Luffy's ears. Up until now, the little boy was hardly interested in the crowd, but now with everyone being so hush and whispering, he took a vague interest. "What's going on?" asked the boy to the crowd. Those closest around stopped speaking instantly. Already, they could tell that their whispers had reached the boy. Luckily, it seemed that he hadn't heard the more troubling part of their talks. Still, no one wanted to reply back to the boy in fear of letting their rumors slip. They were saved when the door from the house opened. Out walked the doctor, Whoop Slap, and Makino. Noticing this as well, Luffy turned back to his home. He began smiling, believing that all was okay. "Finally, you're all done," stated the boy innocently before asking, "Is mommy okay?"
Immediately upon hearing the boy, the 3 adults grew solemn. Makino visibly showed much more emotion though than the 2 older men. Despite having finally calmed down, tears threatened to fall as she looked down at Luffy's smiling being. In an attempt to avoid the boy's gaze, she looked away while also trying to keep her tears in check. This initially confused the boy.
"What are you doing, Makino?" asked Luffy, confused. "Boy," Whoop Slap said as he quickly intervened, "your mother would like to see you now." Instantly, Luffy forgot about Makino's action. He looked at the mayor and smiled happily. "Okay." He then marched inside grinning from ear to ear. Once the boy was inside, the crowd began to move around the mayor. They all began asking questions. How is Star, Mayor? Is everything alright? Is she okay? Whoop Slap immediately became irritated by all the questions. Quiet, he shouted, silencing the crowd. Once they were quiet, the mayor spoke again, calmly. Everyone, the situation is not good. As Mayor Whoop Slap explained the situation to the village, Luffy was already inside his home. He could not hear anything going outside, nor did he really care. His complete focus was on his mother, lying in bed. In seeing her, his first instinct was to run up to the bed, jump, and land with a splash that would make both him and his mother laugh. While he got the running part down, he stopped before he could jump as he saw his mother closer. Though he could see her smiling, he could see that there was something off about her this time.
While Luffy stood at her bedside slightly dazed, Star finally looked at her son. While she still kept her smile, there was obvious hints of sadness being shown with it. She didn't want to let on to her condition yet. Hello, sweetie.
Hi, Mommy. Luffy replied back without his usual excited energy. What's wrong, sweetie? Star asked, worried. I don't know, the boy replied back, confused. This made Star frown. Even if she didn't tell him, her son had an uncanny ability to read the emotions of the room, even if he didn't understand what those emotions were. She didn't want her son to be like this, so she had an idea. Luffy, she said, putting on a genuine smile. How about I tell you your favorite story? Luffy gasped in surprise. Really? He said with excitement. Star nodded before she patted the spot next to her on the bed. Immediately, the boy crawled onto the bed and took up the spot. While sitting in his spot, Luffy WWN excitedly. Not wanting to keep her son waiting, Star soon began to tell the story. So, once upon a time, there was a pirate named Gold Roger. So, Star told the story of the Pirate King and his grand adventures to Luffy. This of course wasn't the first time she had told this story to her son. Star had probably told this story countless times throughout the young boy's life. It was by far his most favorite bedtime story and a constant source of his dreams and admiration. He loved all the adventures that the Pirate King went on, not knowing that most of them were made up by Star through rumor and hearsay. She always did her best to inspire the boy's imagination. This time was no different, and probably even more important now than ever before.
And as he stood before all the people of the world about to be executed, he grinned proudly.
Star said as she continued to tell the story of the Pirate King to her son. Then, a bystander shouted out to the man, Hey, Pirate King. Where did you hide your treasure? And the Pirate King responded back, his last words resonating within the hearts of all those who wished for adventure. You want my treasure? You can have it. I left everything I gathered together in one place. Now you just have to find it? Yeah, shouted Luffy, completely pumped up and excited.
Star laughed before continuing the story. Then, the Pirate King was executed and the crowd roared with excitement. The idea of a grand treasure hidden by the Pirate King swelled the hearts and dreams of many. And soon, many people began setting out on their own adventures to find the Pirate King's treasure, One Piece. Thus, the Great Pirate Age had begun. Yeah, I'm gonna find it. Luffy shouted, suddenly even more excited as he stood up on the bed. I'm gonna find the One Piece and become king of the pirates.
The woman beamed brightly as she looked at her son, witnessing his enthusiasm. It was completely heartwarming seeing her son have such a fantastic goal. It didn't matter to Star if he was going to become a pirate. She just cared that her son was happy. Which made it all the more difficult as she realized again that her time was limited. Luffy turned to see his mother. He flashed her a bright grin about to speak, but could not when he saw her. Mommy, he spoke confused, why are you crying? Star looked at her son surprised before she placed her hand on her cheek. She felt the tears on her cheek, and realized that she was breaking again. Oh, she said, attempting to feign surprise, I. Mommy, Luffy said again, staring at her with wide eyes, is something wrong? It was then after hearing Luffy that Star knew that her attempt to hide her condition had failed. Though she knew he had no idea of it, she could tell that he was onto her. It was time to tell him. Luffy, there is something wrong with Mommy. Something wrong with Mommy? Luffy repeated, confused, tilting his head. Yes. Star said lowly, trying her best to keep her emotions in check again. Mommy is sick, very sick. But didn't the doctor help you? Star shook her head slowly. He couldn't this time. She then went quiet as she tried to figure a way to say the next part as lightly as possible. She doubted she could. There is no easy way to tell someone you're dying. Luffy, finally, Star decided that there was no way to make this sentence light. She looked Luffy straight into his eyes, trying to be as serious as possible. Then, like a sticky band-aid, she told him. I'm dying. What? Said Luffy, shocked. I'm dying, Luffy. Star said again as she began to emotionally break. I'm not going to be around anymore to take care of you. But, Luffy said as his eyes began watering up, but what about watching me become the Pirate King? Star closed her eyes as tears threatened to fall. She shut her mouth tight, not wanting to speak. In her current state, The pain in her throat would cause her voice to crack due to her sadness and grief. She didn't want to falter like that in front of her son. But, Luffy said, continuing on despite his own sadness slowly overcoming him, "You'll be there for my birthday, right?" Some noise escaped from Star, but she quickly covered her mouth with her hand. Though her eyes were still closed, tears had begun leaking through. She wouldn't last much longer. Neither would Luffy. With his mother remaining silent, the boy wasn't faring emotionally well either. The boy was already letting his tears flow out like waterfalls. His expression showed both fear and sadness staring at his mother. Finally, he shouted out in a cry of desperation, "Mommy." Hearing Luffy, Star couldn't hold it in. In an instant, she reached out and engulfed her son in a hug. She let out a cry as she held her son close, letting her tears flow out. All the while, she kept repeating over and over in sorrow, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." Luffy couldn't handle it any longer. He suddenly jerked out of his mother's hold, much to her surprise. Incidentally, his sudden jerking motion had also caused him to fall off the bed. "Luffy!" Star called out while also extending her hand and arm out. Though she was still shedding tears, she was now more concerned for her son's safety than sad. Ever resilient, Luffy recovered quickly. While he saw his mother's hand extended offer him help, just seeing her and being reminded of her dire condition made the boy's emotions betray his usual instinct. He instead moved away from his mother and eventually take off running out the house. "Luffy!" Star shouted out again. She was about to go after him, but suddenly she had another coughing fit that stopped. Outside, the villagers had been surprised when they saw Luffy come running out. It was even more concerning seeing the boy crying and running off. "Luffy," said one of the male villagers, confused. "Where's he going?" Still around, Makino heard the villager and then quickly turned to find the boy. "Luffy," she shouted worriedly. "Boy!" shouted Whoop Slap, slightly angered. "Oi, Mayor!" shouted another male villager closer to the Star's home. "Star's coughing really badly." "Damn it!" Whoop Slap said, growling slightly, "Take care of Star first." Immediately, the doctor and a few male villagers rushed inside the home. While the crowd's focus was back on the home and the woman inside. Only Makino seemed to keep her attention on the boy fleeing towards the village. She quickly took off running to follow the boy. Whoop Slap took notice of this, but did nothing. He knew that the situation with Luffy was in good hands. Seeing how both situations were being handled, Whoop Slap began walking back into town, much to the curiosity of some villagers. "Mayor, where are you going?" Whoop Slap responded solemnly, "I need to make a call." It had taken her a few minutes, but Makino eventually caught up with Luffy. He had taken her through the village and then along the coastline. She eventually found him on the ledge extended out over the ocean. Even from a distance, she could see the state the boy was in. He was curled up and sitting facing towards the ocean despite not actually looking at it. The boy's head was set into his arms, obviously hiding his sadness and tears. As she slowly and cautiously approached the boy, she soon could hear his muffled cries and sniffles. She was also beginning to hear a few things from him. "Don't go, please." Makino stopped and frowned in sadness. She understood that Luffy wasn't talking about her. She doubted he even realized she was here. Despite it, she wasn't going to leave the boy alone. She took up a spot next to the boy and sat down next to him. Silently, she wrapped Luffy in a side hug, offering both comfort and also sharing in his grief. Star had asked her to take care of her son, and by whatever deity, she would do so the best she could. "Huh? Hello?" Back in the village, Whoop Slap sat in his house at the table with a transponder snail nearby. The gruff voice from earlier came from the snail. The snail, with its psychic link to its partner somewhere in the world, it relayed facial expression of the one on the other side. At the moment, the snail had an expression of confusion through looking as gruff the man's voice on the other side. Hearing the voice, Whoop Slap responded back through the receiver. "Garp, it's me, Whoop Slap." "Huh? Whoop Slap?" The voice responded back as well as showing an expression of confusion. "What's the meaning of this? When do you make important calls to me?" "Garp," Whoop Slap said, looking grim. "I have bad news to tell about Star." "What did she do this time?" Garp responded, with the snail showing his annoyance. "She didn't beat up another marine, did she?" "No, Garp," Whoop Slap responded. "This is much more serious." The snail's expression began to look concerned. Star is dying." 3 days later, Monkey D. Star passed away peacefully. Garp had arrived later that same day. Too late to say his own goodbyes to her personally. On the next day, a funeral was prepared for her. It was raining on this day, but no one cared. To them, it was as if the heavens themselves were crying for the loss of a bright star. Appropriate, as there was barely a dry eye among the crowd.
Even with the rain pouring like cats and dogs, the whole village turned out to say their last goodbyes to the woman. They all stood around Star's home as they each entered and paid their respects to the woman's surviving family. Makino, Whoop Slap, and Garp stood with Luffy as these people came by him. The poor boy looked tired. He probably had the worst 3 days of his life before this day. He just stood before everyone, emotionless and unfeeling.
Once everyone had paid their respects, it was time to bring Star to her final resting place.
Though a group of village men were prepared to carry the casket, Garp took the whole burden upon himself. "It's the least I can do," was his response when asked. No one argued with him and allowed him to carry the coffin solo. Everyone followed Garp in procession as they headed to the cemetery, family and close friends right behind him. The walk was long, especially in the rain, but they soon reached the plot of land where Star would be buried. With everyone giving one last goodbye, Star and her casket were covered with earth and buried. A grave marker was set up soon after. It read,
"In loving memory of Monkey D. Star, caring mother, loving wife, and dear friend." After many more minutes of silence, the crowd of people began making their way back to the village, continuing so in silence. By the minute, the crowd got smaller and smaller until all that was left was those closest to Star. Even in the rain, they stayed in their spots as long as they could bear. Eventually though, it was their time to leave. Whoop Slap and Makino took Luffy back to the village as it soon became clear that the boy was hungry, even if he didn't want to admit it. All who was left at the grave was Garp, who had soon taken to seating on the wet ground. Throughout the whole ceremony, he had remained stoic, never letting a single tear flow. Or maybe they were flowing, but with the rainwater flowing down his face it was impossible to tell. It was still clear though that he was sad. As he sat before his daughter-in-law's grave, he began recalling memories of the girl that he held precious. "You're pretty tough, girl," a young Garp said as he sat at a bar with a child Star sitting next to him. She was covered in scrapes and bruises, but otherwise, she looked fine as she drank her juice. The young Garp smiled as he then suggested to the girl, "You could make a fine Marine one day." "I could?" the small girl questioned with interest. "Maybe I will then." Skip ahead now a few years later, Star now was a teenager, and a pretty defiant one at that. She stood before Garp, looking a little older now, who looked ripe with anger. "What?" he shouted in anger and annoyance. "What do you mean you don't want to be a Marine anymore?" "Shut up, you old Marine bastard," Star replied, annoyed and irritating. "If I leave, who is gonna protect this village from attack? Certainly not you." Grab growled with annoyance and was about to teach the girl some manners. He stopped however as he caught sight of Makino, as a child, standing behind her. She looked to be admiring her greatly for whatever reason. Immediately, Garp's anger dissipated and he just sighed wryly. "Fine," he said, sounding almost defeated, "do whatever you want. Probably not a bad idea for this village actually." "Hey!" Garp now watched with interest as his son, Dragon, stood in the streets of Windmill Village. Opposite him was Star, who looked ready to fight him. He watched as Star shouted, "You gonna fight me, Marine boy?" Dragon looked at the girl annoyed. "I am not a Marine, girl." "Doesn't matter." Star replied with an arrogant grin. "You're Garp's son, which means you must be strong, right? Or are you gonna run to your daddy for protection?" Garp let out a loud laugh. Though he knew his son would never do such an unmanly act, he loved seeing Star egg his son on. He then watched as his son begrudgingly took the bait and readied to fight Star. Garp truly wondered if Star had the strength to fight his son, who had grown pretty fearsome looking. It was a fight worth seeing. What? A few years later, Garp returned to the village for another vacation and to be shocked with some surprising news. "Dragon married you." Star, now a young woman, blushed and smiled, almost looking embarrassed. "Yes," she said gently. "And you're pregnant?" Garp shouted further as he looked down at the woman's small swollen belly. The young woman smiled even brighter, proudly, as she softly placed her hands on her stomach and rubbed it lovingly. Again, she responded with the same answer in the same manner, "Yes." Garp couldn't believe it. In just a few short years, Star had gone from a loud rebel rouser to a gentle woman, wife, and mother. Last he had seen of them, they were getting along like cats and dogs. Never would he have guessed his son would marry and have a child with the loud and overconfident protector of Windmill Village. Nor would he had expected those things to change the girl so much. What more could go unexpected for him? Bang! Apparently, the birth of his grandson was more than enough. After some months of duty, Garp returned to see the birth of his grandchild. Though a little late, he got to see him, which surprising made him faint much to everyone's surprise. Garp, Mr. Garp. Whoop Slap and Teen Makino were in the room when they witnessed the Marine Vice Admiral faint at the sight of his grandson. Neither one of them expected the man to pass out like that. All the while, Star laughed at her father-in-law's situation. She couldn't have expected this to happen, but it was a joyous sight. In her hands, the baby monkey D. Luffy smiled brightly despite not understanding what was going on. Garp smiled as he remembered each of these memories of Star fondly. He couldn't have asked for a finer spouse for his son. If only he could not say the same about said son. When the wind picked up suddenly, Garp hardly took any concern by it. He remained in his spot, his smile now gone, and stared at grave marker silently. The wind soon died down, and there was a new sound of someone approaching him. Still, Garp didn't look back. Soon, a figure joined his side and still, the old Marine didn't look at him. "You're too late, son," Garp said to the man, solemnly. The old Vice Admiral paused a moment as the man, Monkey D. Dragon suddenly fell to his knees and hands, not to Garp's surprise. The old man could hear the sobs coming from his regret and grief obvious, but he did not pity him. How would he when he was also in the same boat? Garp soon put his hand up to his face as his own sadness broke his stoic expression. The death of his daughter-in-law, the grief of his son, and the emotionlessness of his grandson was all too much to bear for one old man. We were both too late. A mother's love that which pushes their children into tomorrow. Thus, the story of Monkey D. Star was nearly complete, but now it was time to return to the present. The crew stood silently around Nami as she finished telling Mika, her daughter, of her grandmother on Luffy's side. All of them ever plainly shocked though also saddened by the story. The young girl was far more saddened, nearly to the point of crying again. As the storyteller, Nami had already grieved over this fact, but still frowned knowing her love has had some difficulties in this life. Wow, Usopp said, almost feeling uncomfortable with the knowledge he had learned. I never figured Luffy had any form of sadness in his life. Wah! Frankie cried out as tears feel like waterfalls from his eyes. As they did, he rubbed his eyes trying to clear the tears away, but could not. He let out another loud cry, poor Straw Hat. I never got to know my parents, but he lost his mom at such a delicate age. Wah, I'm not crying. Poor Captain, Brook said sadly. He's always so cheerful and happy, Chopper said feeling sad as well. Zoro grunted. It's because he's moved on that he is how he is. I don't think our captain needs us to pity him for something that occurred long before we knew him, especially when he's behaving fine. Robin nodded in agreement. Luffy seems to have long come to terms with his past. She then smiled and looked at Nami impressed, especially if he even told his wife about it. That idiot, Nami said, mad to the surprise of everyone. He helps all his friends without a second thought, but he doesn't share his own burdens with anyone. Nami? Sanji asked in concern. He was so stubborn, she commented in frustration. I had to threaten him with divorce before he would actually tell me anything. Surprised, Usopp gasped. Wow, Nami, that's a little harsh, don't you think? I wasn't actually going to go through with it, plus, we weren't even married yet, so it would have been pointless. Did he even know what a divorce is? Asked Zoro suspicious. Before I told him, nope, Nami stated matter-of-factly. So, spoke Frankie sounding slightly concerned, after you threatened Straw Hat Bro, he told you about his mother? Yeah, Nami said as she started looking sad as she recalled the moment, but you should have seen him. In Nami's mind, the events of 2 days ago played through mind. She stood in hers and Luffy's room, looking at the man as he sat on the bed. Luffy didn't look like his cheerful self, but rather, he appeared sad and depressed. Though she had been mad earlier from his stubbornness, Nami was now looking at her husband to be in shock. She was shocked by the story of his mother's death, but more so, she was shocked by the tears falling from his eyes. She had never seen Luffy cry over anything. She had at first began to regret her decision to force her love to tell her what was bothering him, but on the other hand she was also glad. This was a moment they were sharing together, not with the crew, and it was personal. Nami then went up to the man and hugged him, giving him as much comfort as she could give. Remember, we're a team, Luffy. If something is bothering you or you're feeling down, I'll always be here for you. You've given me support when I needed it, so let me be yours, please. I had never seen him like that. It was almost heartbreaking knowing that someone so strong and cheerful had his own share of sadness in his life. The crew remained silent as they were caught by surprise by Nami's statement. Never would many of them think their captain weak in any situation, but it was surprising how human their captain could be. The man that smiled at death, laughed at danger, and bravely fought with all his strength. In a way, it was almost relieving. Then, Nami felt a tug on her shirt and she looked down at Mika. The little girl had been quiet throughout their talks, but now she looked like she wanted to say something. She spoke sounding confused. Is Daddy sad now? Nami was a little shocked by the question. Of course, hers and the crew's conversation was hardly comforting for a little girl in her emotional state. But thinking over her question, Nami realized that there was a very simple answer. No, she said, smiling down at her daughter, Daddy isn't sad now. Mika's eyes widened with surprise. Because, Nami continued as he bent down to Mika's level, he has us. You, me, and the whole crew. And we're not going to make him sad, right? Instantly, the little girl smiled and nodded. Yeah. Yeah, shouted Usopp, Sanji, Chopper, Frankie, and Brook cheerfully after Mika. Zoro and Robin did not speak, but it was evident on their faces that they too agreed, even nodding to show it as well. Mika, in seeing her family in high spirits, giggled with excitement. Suddenly, her stomach let out a low growl. Unfortunately for her, the whole group heard her, and all of them began laughing. The little girl quickly stopped giggling and began blushing in embarrassment. Sanji was the first to finish laughing. I know that sound all too well, he commented before he stepped forward towards Mika. He then asked the young girl, would the young madam like to have lunch now? Still embarrassed, Mika let out a nod. Yes please, she said quietly. Then, she followed Sanji as they headed back to the sunny. Lunch sounds good right about now. Robin commented with a smile before she started walking after Mika and Sanji. Hearing Robin, Sanji was instantly enamored. "Hi, Robin Schwan," he declared without hesitation. "I'll make you anything you want." "All right," cheered Frankie as he, Zoro, and Brooke joined the archaeologist. "Let's get some lunch." As everyone began heading back, Usopp was the only one looking concerned. "Hey, wait," he called out, stopping everyone momentarily. "What about Akio and Luffy?" Nami, having stood back up once Mika left, looked at the long-nosed sniper. "I told you already," she said confidently before walking forward to join the others. "Luffy will take care of it." Akio didn't know why he was running through the forest with no clear destination in mind, nor did he know why he had shouted at Mika's mother, who had been nothing but nice to him, but what he did know was that he didn't want to see anyone. The loss of his mother had been hard on him, and though he tried to be strong, it was too much for him to do. So he ran away from his mother's grave, hoping that it was a bad dream and that he would wake up in his bed with his mother, healthy and happy, preparing breakfast. Unfortunately, as he was running blindly in a forest, the various scratches from branches and bushes kept constantly reminding him this was not a dream. While running, he never took the time to notice his surroundings. Of course, most of it was forest, but he failed to notice that there were others in this forest. 3 dangerous-looking men that were already angry at something that had happened before. And since he wasn't totally looking where he was going, he ran right into these men only to fall back. Instantly, the men took notice of the boy. Immediately, they all began grinning maliciously. Well, said one of the men. "Look who's returned. The little punk we used to catch the Straw Hats." After recovering, Akio looked up to see the men. He quickly took notice of their glares and cruel smirks and became afraid. "Never thought we'd see you again," the other man said, sounding almost pleased. Before Akio could make a run for it, the third man quickly picked the boy up by the back of his collar. "We lost everything after you skedaddled," he said to the boy evilly, "but now that we have you, we can get the money back that the boss gave you." "But," Akio said, truly afraid, "I already spent it." "What?" shouted the third man. The first man, however, wasn't as worried as his partner. "No problem," he said, smirking cleverly as he walked up to the boy's face. "We'll just have to make him work to pay us back." "No," cried out Akio. "You don't get say, punk," the third man shouted before purpose. "You're gonna be working for us now." The second man laughed cruelly. He stepped forward towards the boy and crouched down. "Yeah, you're gonna be paying us back and then some," he stated arrogantly as he poked the boy harshly. Akio, already a mess of jumbled emotions, was not liking being talked down to or being poked. Quickly, the young boy attacked and bit the hand of the man poking him, clamping down with all his might. "Yow!" shouted the second in pain. He pulled back, but with Akio still biting down, it caused him even more pain. He began shouting out with pain, "Get him off." Immediately, the first man punched the boy, but Akio didn't let go. He just bit down harder on the man's hand. The first man then continued to punch the boy, trying to get him off. Akio kept his eyes closed as the man continued punching him. The pain was excruciating, and after only a few more punches, Akio let go and fell to the ground. "Damn that son of a bitch!" shouted the second man as he held his injured hand. He looked at his hand worriedly before saying, "I think he drew blood." Akio looked up at the man, his tears falling, but looking angry. He shouted, "Don't call my mom a bitch." "Oh ho, looks like we got a little mama's boy here," the third man said mockingly. The first man cracked his knuckles, sneering. "Let's beat it out of him," he stated cruelly. "Couldn't agree more," the second man smirking evilly. Quickly, Akio stood up. He put up his fists ready to fight, and he was ready to fight. He was going to release all of his emotions, his grief, his pain, and his helplessness out on the men. And despite his bravado, he was very much afraid. He knew he hadn't a chance to beat these 3 big men. He would be pulverized, but he didn't want to back down. He was going to fight, both to stand up for himself and maybe even relieve him of his depressing emotions. The outcome didn't matter to him. The men roared and rushed at Akio. The boy closed his eyes, not wanting to see the tough and scary-looking men come at him. Still, he didn't want to go down fighting. He threw out a punch, aiming high, hoping that it would hit one of them. So he waited with his fist extended out, hoping to get one of them, and his eyes closed for the inevitable beatdown he would receive. Then, something strange happened. Keeping his eyes closed, Akio realized that after many seconds of waiting that no one was hurting him. In fact, not one of the men were speaking or making any kind of noise. Eventually, he realized he had to open his eyes to see what those men were doing. So, begrudgingly, he opened one eye to see. "Hi!" Immediately, the happily grinning face of Luffy greeted the young. "Ah!" screamed Akio before falling backwards from shock. Seeing the boy fall back, Luffy snickered, amused. He then stood up and extended his hand out to the boy, looking cheerful. "You alright?" he asked, curious. Breathing out heavily to calm his nerves, Akio at first just stared at the man, surprised to see him. He eventually calmed down and looked at the man's hand before taking it. "Yeah," he said numbly as he was helped up. "Good," Luffy said happily. "What are you doing here?" Akio asked immediately. And what happened to those 3 guys? Hey, I beat them up, easy, Luffy stated proudly as he pointed his thumb back behind himself. Curiously, Akio looked behind the man. He found that what the man said was true. All 3 men were knocked out, and in various positions, one of which was currently stuck in a tree. He was surprised at first, but then he remembered who this man was and actually found it rather believable. And I'm here because, Luffy said, continuing his explanation, I had an offer for you, Akio. Akio looked at the pirate in disbelief, then in annoyance. He told the man, look, I've already had enough of bad deals for one day. I want you to join my crew, Luffy flat out stated without hesitation. Shocked, the chocolate brown-haired boy looked at the man again in disbelief. He wasn't sure if the pirate captain was being truthful or just messing with him. He decided on the latter, which just made him angry. Yeah right, he said before trying to leave. As the boy walked past him, Luffy instantly grew serious. I'm serious, Akio, he stated solemn. Upon hearing the man, Akio stopped. He became even angrier as he still believed that man was not taking him seriously. He turned around shouting, I don't want to be a. Your mom asked me to take you in, Luffy said, immediately interrupting the boy's shout. He didn't look back at the boy, but he figured the boy was stunned by what he said. After a moment, he continued, I told her that it was up to you what you did. She, Akio said, almost speechless. It's still your choice, Akio. Only you can decide how to live your life. Luffy then began walking forward. Before leaving, he glanced back at Akio, flashing him his trademark, happy grin. Just try not to regret it, he said before leaving. Remaining silent, Akio looked over towards the direction the man went only to find him already gone. He was alone now, forgetting that there were 3 unconscious men behind him, and for the first time in his young life he thought about himself. How odd it felt for him having been helping his mother for so long. Now, he had a choice to make, one that he could make fully on his own. His mother had thought it a good idea to go with the Straw Hats, but did he want to leave for life at sea? There were great challenges out at sea, more so for pirates, and he wasn't sure he could handle that. He would be with the bad guys, though he admitted that these pirates were hardly bad people, and his mother knew that. Then, there was staying here. Already, he was in trouble with a gang. He had no family to count on or friends to help him, and he doubted many people on this island would be willing to help him out of charity. Still, he could make a life of his own relying on himself. But then, the Straw Hats had been very nice to him, and were probably the only people in the world that do care about him. Even his only friend, if he could call her that, was a part of the crew. Was joining the Straw Hat Pirates the best thing he could do? Akio had contemplated these thoughts for a while. Then, there came some rustling in the large bushes that broke Akio's thoughts. He looked over at the bush in surprise, wondering who it was coming out. He hoped that it wasn't more gang members. Fortunately, when the figure stepped out, it turned out to be just Luffy. Huh? Said the man before looking around confused. I was sure this was the way to the sunny. What? No it's not, Akio said before pointing in a direction. It's that way, on the east shore. Right. Where it's wetter, Luffy stated confidently, smiling. Immediately, Akio slapped his hand onto his face. Even if he was a kid, even he knew that's not how the cardinal directions worked. He realized that this adult was going to need some help. Come on, the boy said, slightly annoyed, I can lead you back. Oh, thanks, Luffy said in gratitude, keeping his smile. The chocolate brown-haired boy didn't respond back. He started leading the man back towards his ship. Luffy was happy enough as he followed the boy, not even recalling the time when the same boy had led him and his crew into a trap. He fully trusted the boy. As the two trudged through the forest, while Luffy happily and badly sung his island song, Akio remained silent as he focused on getting the man back to his crew. Sanji walked up next to Mika with a plate of food in hand. He set the plate and drink on the table she sat at. It was a simple meal of drumsticks and an assortment of vegetables. Here you are, Mika Heim, the man said to the little girl politely. At first, Mika was excited until she saw the small veggies on the plate. Instantly, she looked at them with disgust. She instead grabbed the chicken leg and thanked the man for the meal. Thank you, Uncle Sanji. The little girl's polite gratitude hit Sanji's heart like a familial love arrow from Cupid. The man swayed a row up. Ah, so cute. Also sitting at the table, Nami watched on now looking amused. You're going to eat your vegetables, young lady, she told her daughter sternly. In response, Mika looked back at her mother, seemingly copying her expression. But they are gross, she stated coolly, and daddy doesn't eat them. The blonde chef chuckled as he collected a few dishes, glasses mostly, not for the lack of trying, Heim, he said before leaving to take the dishes back to the kitchen. Oh believe me, Missy, your father will be eating his when he gets back. Nah, Mika stated in a bratty tone. She then took a bite out of her chicken, acting as if she was right. Nami then placed her hand on her forehead. There's no way I was this bad, right, Belmere? She asked as if her own mother was present. She imagined, in heaven, she was laughing it up. While Mika ate and Nami contemplated her child-raising skills, the rest of the crew was doing their own activities to pass the time until Luffy came back. Usopp and Chopper were fishing, Brook sat nearby them drinking tea, and Robin was on a lounge chair sunbathing. The only ones not seen currently were Zoro, Frankie, and Sanji, the latter of who was in the kitchen cleaning dishes. Zoro was up in the crow's nest weight training and Frankie was in his workshop working on something. Finishing his duty, Sanji exited out of the kitchen. As he headed to the stairs, he spied towards the forest hearing some noise. Breaking through the brush, he spotted Akio leading Luffy out of the forest. Sanji smirked with amusement, finding it the scene very likely. He then turned to the crew and called out, "Oi, Luffy's back." Instantly, everyone stopped what they're doing. "All right," shouted Usopp excited, "about time." Sanji then added to his statement, "And Akio's with him too." "Really?" Brook said surprised. "But he could just be here to help our idiot captain with directions." Immediately, Nami placed her hand on her face in frustration. She had forgotten her husband's bad knowledge on direction. Hearing that her father was back, Mika immediately stopped eating. She then rushed over to the side and hopped onto Shiv's side railing. Just hanging on top, Mika spotted her father and happily grinned. "Daddy, Daddy," she shouted excitedly. Instantly, Luffy heard his little girl's shout. He looked up and spotted her, making him grin happily as well. With a stretch of his arm, Luffy left Akio's side and shot up to the side railing, landing on top of it next to Mika. He then greeted her back, still grinning. "Hiya, Mika." "Daddy, tell Mama that I don't have to eat yucky vegetables," Mika said immediately, believing her father would defend her choice. Before Luffy could open his mouth, saying whatever popped into his mind, he quickly closed it shut tight. Why had he stopped? Right behind Mika at the table, Nami had of course heard her daughter's request and was currently giving her husband the stink eye while tapping her foot demandingly. Instantly, Luffy knew he was caught between a rock and a hard place, but luckily, he had an escape. Hey look, Mika," Luffy said as he pointed back down to shore. "Akio's here." Upon hearing this, Mika had immediately lost interest in her request and looked back towards shore. Seeing the boy, she smiled and became excited. "Akio," she shouted before getting off the railing and running over to the gangplank. At the same time, Luffy jumped off the railing wanting to go with her. "I should go with her," he told Nami before trying to walk away. He didn't get far when Nami's hand grabbed his cheek, stretching it quite a bit as Luffy tried to get away. "You're not going anywhere, Luffy dear," Nami said sweetly yet also seeping with mild anger. The man stopped and looked back at his wife pleadingly. "Nami," Luffy said, whining through his stretched mouth. Mika continued without her father to Akio. She ran down the gangplank as quickly as she could, and then went straight for the boy. "Hi Akio," she said smiling as she stopped next to the boy. "Hey," Akio said, a little surprised, but mostly monotonous. "Do you want to play?" Mika asked cheerfully. Again, the boy was surprised. "Don't you have to leave soon?" he asked back confused. "Oh yeah," Mika said in realization. She then turned to the sunny and shouted loudly at it. "Mama, when do we have to leave?" "Soon," Nami said loudly from somewhere on board the ship. Mika frowned before turning back to Akio. "I guess so," she said a little sad. "Well," Akio said, though stopped unable to find the right words. He was going to try and play off his disappointment by being aloof, but he felt that it wasn't right. So instead, he said, "Well, I'm gonna miss you." The little girl smiled. "I'll miss you too. You sure that there's no way you could stay here?" asked Akio out of the blue. "It's dangerous out at sea with pirates." "I know," Mika said bluntly before grinning happily. "But my family is super strong, they can handle anything." Akio wasn't surprised by how confident the little girl spoke of her family. By all means, he knew she spoke the truth, especially after seeing their whole crew, most of them anyway, had bounties. They probably could do anything they set their minds to do, which made Akio remember the captain's offer from earlier. "I want you to join my crew." Mika," Akio spoke sounding nervous. "Oi," suddenly, there came Zoro's voice over the transponder snail intercom interrupting Akio. By the sound of his tone, it sounded urgent. "First see a marine battleship." "Crap," shouted Usopp's voice. "I see it too, everyone," shouted Luffy's voice now. "Set sail." Nami soon appeared before the children on the ship. Quickly, she shouted, "Mika, hurry back on board." "Okay," Mika shouted back. She then looked back at her friend, giving him an apologetic smile. "Sorry, Akio, I have to go." "Wait," Akio shouted quickly, stopping Mika immediately. The boy wasn't yet ready to say goodbye. It had been too soon. Now, there wasn't enough time. "Akio," Mika said, sounding worried, taking a step back towards the sunny, "I need to." "Is it okay if I joined?" Akio blurted out quickly and loudly. He had his eyes closed tight and his whole body went completely rigid. Not knowing how the young girl was reacting, he continued on speaking. "Your dad said I could, and my mom thought it was a good idea, but is it okay for me to join?" Mika stopped moving after hearing the boy speak out. She looked a little confused. It was a strange question to be asked. Though, it didn't take Mika long to figure an answer out. She began smiling and rushed over to the nervous boy. Immediately, she took his hand. Akio was shocked when he felt someone grab his hand. He tensed even more and opened his eyes to see that it was Mika holding it. He instantly began blushing, having never really held hands with a girl before. He stuttered, Mika. Of course it's okay. Mika stated unashamedly, grinning with joy. Because we're friends, right? Before he could say anything, Akio was suddenly pulled by Mika towards the Thousand Sunny. Quickly, the girl pulled the boy up the gangplank and hopped onto the deck. They both stood on the deck watching while all the adults ran about preparing to sail off. Despite them knowing the kids were aboard, they hadn't the time to acknowledge them like Frankie and Brooke as they brought up the gangplank. We're ready, Nami, shouted Usopp from high above on the mast along with Zoro and Chopper. Is Mika on board? Asked Nami before taking a glance around the deck. She quickly spotted her daughter along with Akio. Immediately, she smiled seeing the boy aboard with them. Good job, Mika, she thought proudly. She then shouted out to the crew, let's get sailing, Frankie. Aye, girly, Frankie replied back with a happy grin as he turned the steering wheel. The Thousand Sunny began turning and then sailing out of the cove. With its sails down, the ship floated out into the open ocean and in clear sight of the lone marine ship. Immediately, the battleship began firing on the ship through the air before landing in the waters around the Thousand Sunny. They exploded, sending up a column of water that sprayed all over the ship. The fighters, Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji, immediately prepared to defend the Sunny. Mika seemed to be enjoyed the spray of water falling down upon her while Akio was already freaking out. What's happening? Akio shouted, confused and scared. Mika stopped enjoying herself and answered her friend's question. Oh, it's just the Marines, she said casually, but we'll be okay. You're sure? Akio said, still a bit panicked. Nodding, Mika happily grinned, proving her confidence. Then, she suddenly had a thought. Oh wait. What? Shouted Akio, now back to panicking. He believed that Mika may have had a second thought about the situation. This time, the girl did not reply back to him. Akio watched as the girl suddenly took off, heading towards the other side of the ship. He quickly called out in fear, Mika. Akio? Luffy's voice immediately caught Akio's attention and he turned around to see the man looking at him surprised. Instantly, the boy no longer felt panicked, but now felt a little nervous seeing the man looking at him. Being nervous, Akio looked down at the grass, unable to make eye contact with the man. Captain Luffy, he said timidly, may I join your crew? Sure, Luffy said instantly, grinning happily, before giving his hand out to Akio. Welcome aboard, Akio. Seeing the man offer his hand, Akio stuck out his hand to shake it. The moment he made contact, the man suddenly pulled the boy up. He was so surprised by the sudden action that he barely had time to react. He was then set on Luffy's shoulder, being seated securely. He was now confused. What was the man doing with him? Hey, everyone, Luffy shouted loudly for the whole crew to hear. We've got a new crewmate. Robin chuckled upon hearing her captain's shout. Wonderful, she commented amusedly. Great, Zoro said uninterested. Afterwards, he jumped up and sliced through 2 cannonballs with his 2 swords. That's super, Straw Hat, shouted Frankie joyfully, giving out a thumbs up. Yo-ho-ho-ho, chuckled Brooke as he walked up next to the boy. He then lifted his hat and bowed towards the child politely. Welcome aboard, Mr. Akio. That's great, shouted Usopp happily from atop the mast. Welcome, Akio, shouted Chopper overjoyed. Thanks, Akio said, though still a little nervous. After kicking 1 cannonball into another and then landing, Sanji also gave out his congratulations. Just try not to do anything funny with our Mikaheim, he stated seriously. Instantly, Sanji realized something and began looking around concerned. Speaking of, where is Mikaheim? He asked curiously. He eventually spied the girl over on the other side of the deck, towards the Marines. She seemed to be waving. At the same time, on the Marine battleship, while the Marine soldiers fired on the pirate ship, Commodore Smoker was overseeing the attack. As always, he looked far from pleased with his men's work as they had yet to stop the boat. Of course, in part to missing occasionally, their target was well defended as well, which only furthered his frustration in not being able to capture the Straw Hat pirates. He soon began walking around the deck overseeing the men's aim and trajectory of the cannons. While he did so, he spotted Tashigi at the bow of the ship spying at the enemy through binoculars. As he approached the woman, he noticed that his trusty second-in-command was smiling affectionately and oddly cooing. Ah, Tashigi, Smoker shouted suddenly. Ah, screamed Tashigi, nearly dropping the binoculars. She then immediately replied back while blushing embarrassed. CC Commodore Smoker, sir. What in the blazes are you looking at? Smoker asked rudely before also taking the binoculars from the young woman. As the woman had done, the Marine officer looked through the binoculars towards the Straw Hats. The sight he saw shocked him greatly. Through the binoculars, Smoker could see nearly all the way to the Straw Hats ship. There, waving right back at him happily and carefree, was the little girl Mika that he had helped out some days ago. She unashamedly waved back to them, him and Toshigi, probably sending her farewells to them. He could see why his second-in-command was gushing earlier, but the man himself would do no such thing. His pride would never allow for that. Rather, it just proved to make him a little angrier. He then watched as Black Leg Sanji appeared in his scope. He looked down at Mika, and then out towards his own ship. The blonde man apparently freaked, probably from seeing him, and then took Mika away from his line of sight. Instantly, Smoker began growling angrily. He looked over at Toshigi and told her, "No more gawking." "Yes, sir," Toshigi said quickly, giving him a salute. After handing her binoculars back, Toshigi watched as Smoker walked away. Clearly to go yell at some other marine soldiers for not sinking the Straw Hats' ship already. She figured that, even if he did like the child, he would not go easy on any pirates and needed to vent that frustration out. She giggled a bit seeing how funny her commanding officer could be when it came to matters of emotions. While not using her binoculars, Toshigi looked back at the Straw Hats' ship. At the spot where Mika once stood at and waved to her, she smiled as she thought to herself. "Goodbye, Mika. I hope we can meet again on better terms." "That was very dangerous, young lady." Back on the Sunny, Nami was scolding Mika for her stunt earlier. It was clear, to everyone really, that the little didn't care and proved so by looking away from her mother defiantly. This just caused the young woman to become even angrier at the girl. Then, from down below, Frankie popped up. "All right," he said confidently, "the cola engine is ready." "The sails are up," shouted Zoro from above on the mast. Akio looked around confused. "What's going on?" he asked. "Why are we stopping?" Luffy snickered playfully as he walked up next to Akio and then crouched down by him. "We're gonna escape, that's why," he told the boy cheerfully. "How?" Akio asked, even more confused. "Here we go, at the helm," Sanji shouted back to everyone as he pulled the lever by the helm. "Get ready, Akio," Usopp said as he and nearly everyone joined the boy on the grass deck. "You're about to go on the best ride ever." "Ride? Coo," Frankie shouted excited. Below the deck, the cola engine with 3 barrels in it began compressing and decompressing. It started out slow, but it soon went faster and faster, charging up. At the same time, at the stern of the Thousand Sunny, the large cannon began charging with compressed air indicated by a glow. "What ride?" asked Akio, still confused. "Duh, what's going to happen?" "Burst," shouted all the crew and Mika as well. Immediately, the compressed air that had been building up was finally released. The Thousand Sunny was shot up into the air. This surprised not only Akio, but the Marines as well. Smoker and Toshigi were completely shocked over the feat. There was no way they could catch up with them now. Meanwhile on the Thousand Sunny, Akio screamed out in fright but also in joy as he experienced this new sensation. He couldn't believe it, he was flying on a pirate ship leaving his home forever. New experiences were awaiting him out at sea. He didn't know what they would be, but he would face them with his crew. Still, the boy found himself looking back at his home island, getting farther and farther away by the second. He hardly cared for the island itself and all the people on it, but it was the place where he grew up on and was raised by his mother, who was also buried on it. For that alone, he looked back on the island sadly. As the island soon shrank to nothing but a small dot, Akio had but one last thought towards the island. "Goodbye, Mom. Cheers for our new member, Akio." Kanpai. It was now nearly evening with the sun just half down below the horizon. Though they didn't have time earl the Marines on their tails, now that they were in the clear they could give the boy a proper Straw Hat welcoming party. So, with mugs in hand, everyone gave out an excited cheer as they raised their mugs high expressing their joy. Of course, only the adults had alcohol, the children had Mike and juice. Everyone kept Akio center attention, telling him of their adventures, the potential the boy had, and many of comforting topics. All the while, the boy was completely embarrassed by the attention, but secretly enjoyed it. At some point, Luffy and Nami had disappeared from the party. No one really minded, especially not Akio, but Mika had soon taken notice of her parents missing. As everyone continued to drown Akio with attention, Mika decided to look for her parents. From the grassy deck, she walked up the stairs and headed up to the upper deck where the helm was located. She found that they weren't there, but it didn't seem to matter as she hurried over towards the figurehead of the Sunny. As she climbed up the small set of stairs behind Sunny's head, she soon heard her parents' voices. "To think we would have another kid already. And not even our own either. What is happening to our crew, Luffy?" Mika heard her mother's voice say, though it sounded more pleasant rather than concerned. She. I just thought he could be tough when push came to shovel." Mika heard her mother release a sigh. "It's shove, dear. But I hope you're not expecting him to fight full-grown adults." "Nah, but he can make sure Mika will be safe, right?" Right." Eventually, Mika decided to come out. "Hey," she shouted out cheerfully. She waited as her parents, currently sitting on top of Sunny's head with Nami sitting in Luffy's lap, turned to face her, both looking surprised. The little girl then rushed in and dived into her parents before situating herself in her mother's lap. Confused, Nami questioned her little girl, Mika? I want to sit with you too, Mika stated in determination. Nami blinked with surprise, but then began smiling knowing how silly her daughter could be. Very well, she told her daughter before she lightly leaned into the little body. She wrapped her arms around the girl as well, both carrying and protecting her daughter. Luffy just gave out a happy chuckle, not minding the extra weight. What are you doing here anyway? Nami asked curiously to Mika. Shouldn't you be playing with Akio or the others? I wanted to tell Daddy something, Mika stated with a happy grin, looking up at her mother. Luffy said surprised. You do? Mika nodded her before releasing a small giggle with excitement. She then tilted her head back to the point where she could see her mother's and a little of her father's face. She kept her happy grin and she spoke out, I really like Grandma Star. Instantly, Nami gasped with surprise. She hadn't figured on her daughter to suddenly mention Luffy's mother. Concerned for her husband, she glanced back at Luffy wondering what he thought about their daughter's statement. Not surprisingly, the man was smiling happily. Thanks, Mika. Luffy said contently. I bet Mom would have loved you too. He then placed his hand upon his daughter's head. He began gently rubbing the girl's head showing his affection. After a moment of her father's affection, he stopped allowing Mika to speak up once again. Daddy, she spoke curiously, Mama told me about how Grandma died. Oh, yeah, it was really sad. Mika said softly and a little sad. Like what happened to Akio's mom. But, how did you stop being sad? Well, it was kinda thanks to a pirate crew. Like us, Mika said overjoyed. Luffy chuckled. Yeah, kinda like us. A month after Star's death, the people of Windmill Village had begun recovering. It was a rough few weeks, with everyone's spirits down, but they eventually began moving on with their lives. No one would ever forget Star, so they held the brave, young woman in their hearts. This was the same even for those closest to the woman. Whoop Slap had recovered well and soon began yelling at all the young adults again for being so carefree. Makino had recovered her own happiness as well even if she was now missing someone important in her life. Taking care of Luffy had given her a special kind of joy, one she expected that Star had when she was alive. And Luffy, he recovered, but he wasn't the same boy he was when his mother was alive. Though he could be cheerful and excited for anything like always, there was an obvious hint of sadness still lingering. Both Makino and Whoop Slap hoped that one day the boy would be able to smile and be happy earnestly. And that day would come sooner than they ever thought. Pirates! Pirates are coming! A crier ran down the street through Windmill Village repeating the same word over and over again. Of course, he had every reason to. Approaching the docks, with its black flag waving high and proud, was a pirate ship. Thanks to the man's shouts, many people took notice of this ship and then immediately took off running. Most went into their houses, others hid behind buildings or other large objects. Eventually, the large pirate ship docked at Windmill Village's port and the pirates began walking out. In a large group, they walked through the village silently and with purpose being led by a man in a straw hat with red hair. The villagers watched in fear as these men walked through town. All the while, wondering what they would do to their small village. This pirate group eventually found what they were looking for, a bar. Party's bar. As the whole pirate crew waited outside, the leader of the group walked inside. Once inside, he spotted the bartender, Makino, with her back turned against as she cleaned some dishes. He began approaching the counter, taking notice of the child peering from around the counter. The man only smiled contently as he reached the counter. He then gave a tap on the counter before speaking. Excuse me, miss. The man said politely. Makino, who was trying to ignore the pirate, was surprised when she heard the man speak so politely. She turned around to look at the man, only to be shocked by how handsome he looked. She immediately began blushing as she tried speaking back to the man. Why yes, sir. The man's smile brightened a bit with happiness before he began speaking again. Ma'am, I'll be frank with you. My name is Shanks. I am the captain of the pirates I'm sure you've heard of approaching your nice town. Yes. We have no intention of being a nuisance to your village. The man, Shanks, stated sincerely. All we want is to be served some food and alcohol. We will gladly pay, money is no option. Thank you. Makino replied with surprise, while Makino went into the back to start preparing the food. Luffy stayed where he was told to be before the pirate entered. He wasn't scared of the man by any means. In fact, he was becoming increasingly interested in him. So much so that he had entirely blown his cover just to get a closer look at the man. Of course, Shanks had already seen the boy, but now that the boy was now completely out in the open and looking curiously, he decided to make conversation. Hiya, kid. Luffy was surprised, not realizing he had revealed himself, but he responded, hi. Shanks smiled. Sorry, if we scared you. He then pointed towards the kitchen. I promise we have no intention of hurting your mom. Immediately, Luffy shook his head. Makino is a friend. He stated before becoming a little sad, my mom died. Oh, Shanks said surprised and immediately feeling guilty. I'm sorry, kid. Are you really a pirate? Luffy asked suddenly, looking interested instead of sad. A little taken back by the sudden shift in the boy's attitude, but he was happy enough to answer back. Yeah, he said, grinning happily before gesturing towards his men outside. Me and my men. Have you gone on lots of adventures? Of course, Shanks said, giving the boy a wink. Can I hear about them? Luffy said, getting excited. Sure, Shanks said, grinning cheerfully. When eyed from the kitchen, she was surprised to find the whole bar was filled with the pirate crew. They took up nearly every seat in the building. Even more surprising was that she spotted Luffy talking and conversing with a few of the pirates. One of them being the man named Shanks. The little boy was smiling and grinning brightly with excitement and joy for what seemed like the first time in a long time, and that made her happy. She didn't know who these men were or what they have done, but from the bottom of her heart, she was thankful for their arrival. For now it seemed that Luffy had finally gotten back to his usual self, and that's the best she could ask for. Over time, Luffy would grow to eventually become the man he is today. A pirate captain worth 300 million Baileys, a husband and father. He would experience many hardships and joy in his short life, and he would share them with friends and now family. Though he is a forgetful kind of person, he would never forget those important events that would lead him this point. The death of his mother, the arrival and departure of Shanks and his crew, meeting his brothers, and all his adventures after leaving Dawn Island. And it would all start with a simple question. What's a pirate king, mommy? Well, many people say that the pirate king is the worst person in the world, but I like to think that the pirate king, a man who's sailed all over the world, is probably the freest person in the whole world. Going on grand adventures, discovering new things, meeting new people, and finding treasure bound to no one but your faithful crew. That's what I think a pirate king is, sweetie. Can I be a pirate king someday? Yes, Luffy. I believe with all my heart that you could. Life is cabin kids. Mika's frustration and Akio's gratitude. The sun rose over the vast ocean, shining light upon the lone sailing pirate vessel known as the Thousand Sunny. Of course, the light wouldn't be able to reach the room where the children were sleeping in. Both Akio and Mike were peacefully asleep, Mika having been returned back at some point during the night. Neither of them would ever expect, nor even know, what would happen next. The door suddenly swung open, hitting the wall with a bang yet not waking the children up. Then, Brook entered the room with his violin in hand. Mika-chan, Mr. Akio, time to wake up, the skeleton man proclaimed loudly before placing his bow upon the violin's string. He then began playing and singing at a high volume. It's a white handkerchief, careful now, knees on the ground. Run away, yo-ho-ho-ho. With Brook's sudden loud singing, playing, and laughter, both children awoke with a jolt of shock. Wide awake for the moment, both Mika and Akio looked over at the door as the musician continued playing the song, The Black Handkerchief of Happiness. Feeling annoyed with her uncle's song, Mika covered her ears before she shouted, Uncle Brook, it's too early. Ah, good. Noticing the children were awake, Brook stopped playing. He continued on to say, Rise and shine, young crewmates. You have a busy day ahead of you. What? Asked Mika, confused, taking her hands off her ears. The skeleton then gave out a small, soft laugh, yo-ho-ho-ho. He then told them, you both need to report to the kitchen or else you won't have the energy to make through the day. Though he was just as confused as Mika, Akio at least understood that this was a breakfast call of sorts. He immediately got out of bed, ready and willing. On the other hand, Mika was not as ready despite also realizing that it was time for breakfast. She slipped off her bed with the pace of a sloth and joined Akio looking drowsy. Brook then escorted the two topside into the kitchen. The rest of the crew was already there, waiting for Sanji to finish up making breakfast. Immediately upon seeing the kids in the doorway, the crew greeted them. The kids then joined everyone at the table, both sitting next to each other next to Usopp. At that moment, Sanji had finished today's breakfast, pancakes, and everyone began eating. Before Akio could even eat his first pancake, he watched as a stretched out hand took all his pancakes. Hey, Akio shouted before looking over at Luffy, the culprit, he took my pancakes. Settle down, kid. Luffy does this all the time, Usopp stated before forming a cunning smirk. He then whispered to the boy, don't complain, get even. Akio looked at the long-nosed man confused, unsure what he meant. Signaling the boy to be quiet, Usopp then revealed to him a small bottle of Tabasco sauce. He watched as the man quickly tabbed a few drops onto his pancake just as Luffy grabbed it. Immediately, Akio covered his mouth, holding back a laugh, as he watched the food thief eat the spiked pancake. In seconds, Luffy was already screaming out in pain, practically breathing fire like Frankie does. Instantly, Usopp and Akio began laughing out loud. Serves you right, you food thief, Usopp said humorously before laughing again. As he settled down from laughing, Akio noticed someone place down more pancakes in front of him. He looked up to see that it was Sanji, giving him an approving smile, holding a glass of milk. He then told him, you gotta eat fast or defend your food in this kitchen, kid. But don't think we won't have enough, even with that bottomless pit over there. Oh, thank you. Akio replied politely. Sanji nodded coolly before walking back towards the kitchen. He walked past Luffy, mouth still on fire, and as he did, he poured down the whole glass of milk into Luffy's open mouth. The rubber man looked surprised as his cheeks swelled with milk, and then he gulped it all down. Immediately after, he found the burning sensation in his mouth was gone. "Thanks, Sanji," Luffy said, grinning happily with gratitude. "Don't mention it," Sanji replied as he got back to cooking. Ahem. Nami suddenly spoke, gaining her husband's attention. She then stared at him with a serious gaze before speaking. "Doesn't the captain have something to say to our new crew members?" Luffy thought for a moment. "No, not really, except that Usopp's a jerk," he stated with glare towards the sniper. "Oi!" Usopp shouted quickly, offended. "No," Nami said, her patience wearing thin. "What we talked about last night. About getting a lock on the kid's door so Mika doesn't sleepwander out of her room." "What?" Mika shouted, surprised. She didn't completely understand what they meant by that, but she was sure it meant she couldn't sleep with her parents any longer. Nami placed her hand on her head, rubbing it to ease her headache. "Never mind, I'll just tell them," she said, exhausted before turning to the kids. "Today, we're going to start your duties as cabin kids." Akio looked at the woman confused. "Cabin kids?" he asked. "Like cabin boy, but since we also have a girl it sounded better," Frankie stated. "Oh, wait, huh?" Mika said, looking at her mother confused. "Yes, Mika. That means Akio and you will be doing small chores around the ship," Nami stated clearly for her daughter to understand. "Why me too? Because it wouldn't be fair for Akio if you get to laze about and have fun while he works. Besides, it's about time you did more around the ship." Of course, Mika didn't like this idea. She immediately began looking around the room, hoping one of her family would speak out against this injustice, but no one looked interested. Disappointed, she then looked over at her father, lowering her head at him. "Daddy," she said before lifting her head up, revealing her glittering and saddest puppy dog eyes ever. "Do I have to?" "Ah." Instantly, Luffy's heart was struck hard like an electric jolt. He then looked over at his wife looking conflicted. "Nami." Nami crossed her arms, unimpressed. "That's not gonna work." Everyone, seeing that her father wasn't enough, Mika shot her sad gaze at the rest of crew. Much like with her father, she had immediately hooked nearly all of them. Only Zoro and Robin remained unfazed. "Nami," whined those crew members hooked under Mika's spell. "Enough," shouted Nami, enraged at her crew, shutting them up instantly. She then turned her anger towards her daughter. She told off her daughter, "You are going to help Akio, and you are going to do them." In response, Mika stared up at her mother, looking just as angry, even puffing her cheeks up. "Nope," she said definitely. No one said anything. Most of them were too scared to try. The tension between mother and daughter was electric, like an adult cat facing off against an uppity kitten. And like any overconfident kitty, it was about to get a rather sudden slap to its face. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Nami would never hurt her daughter, but she was definitely far more stubborn than her daughter. Of course, Mika eventually lost out to her mother. Now, after breakfast, both Mika and Akio were standing outside on the grass deck awaiting their first duty. Akio looked attentive and ready while Mika was acting sour, still angry that she had to do chores. Soon, Usopp and Frankie arrived bringing up 2 push mowers with bags attached to them. "Okay, guys," Usopp said to the kids, "here's your first job. You guys gotta mow the deck," Frankie stated, grinning optimistically. He also pointed down, indicating which deck. Mika was first to speak, sounding confused, though still looking a little mad. "I didn't know the grass grew." Frankie chuckled. "Of course it does. How else would it stay fresh and super all year around?" After Usopp tinkered with the mowers, adjusting the stands to the kids' height, before he spoke to them. "Don't worry, this will be easy," he told the kids. "All you gotta do is push the mowers we modified and make sure you do it evenly. Afterwards, just dump the grass off the side of the ship." Akio nodded. "Okay." He then went up to the second mower, ready to start. On the other hand, Mika looked suspicious towards her uncles. She began crouching down, placing her eye level with the deck. Mika," spoke Usopp, curious, "what are you doing?" "The grass doesn't look like it needs cutting," Mika stated snootily. "Trust us, lil' sis, it does," Frankie stated, grinning confidently. Usopp immediately walked over to one of the mowers. "Here, look," he told the girl before he pushed the mower a foot or two ahead. Behind him, the grass that the mower ran over definitely looked a little shorter. Usopp then looked over to the girl, smirking confidently. "See?" The little girl walked over to where her uncle had cut. She looked at the spot, squinting her eyes like she could barely see it. In a quick moment, Mika made a smirk before looking unimpressed. "I don't see any difference," she stated apathetically. "What?" Usopp shouted with disbelief. "Maybe you should cut a little more," Mika stated cunningly. The long-nosed sniper immediately huffed his chest up with pride as he placed his hands back on the mower's handle. "Maybe I will," he stated before he began moving the mower. He pushed the device a few feet before stopping. He looked back at the girl and reasserted, "See? The young girl took another look. Nope. Mika replied back smiling, lying. What? Usopp shouted again in disbelief. He then began pushing the mower, starting onto the second row of grass to cut. Frankie, having watched all this, already understood what the little girl was doing. He immediately tried to stop his friend. Hold up, long nose. Not now, Frankie. Usopp stated irritated as he continued mowing. He then turned back to Mika, wearing a prideful grin. How's that, Mika? Looks cut now, I bet. Nope, Mika said quickly, not even looking at her uncle's handiwork. What? Whoa, hold on long nose bro. Frankie said quickly intervening. You're getting manipulated by Lil, sis. Huh? Usopp said before looked around and realized what he was doing. You're right. Mika crossed her arms and began pouting with disappointment. Shoot, she said. Frankie gave out a chuckle. Nice try, but girlie was serious in you doing your duties. He then looked around and then pointed out to Mika. See there, Lil, bro is already doing a super job already. Mika, along with Usopp, looked over towards the other side of the deck. While they did their thing, Akio had already went off to start working. In only a few short moments, the boy had already finished off 2 rows of the deck and starting on the third. He looked pretty content and happy doing the job. The cyborg then looked back at the little girl, smirking, and he hasn't complained at all, he stated teasingly. The young girl huffed up again, having been put in her place by her uncle. Seeing how she could no longer try to manipulate either of her uncles, Mika begrudgingly took the mower and started cutting the grass. All the while, she wore a grumpy face making sure that her family could see that she hated this job. Hey, don't be so grumpy. Usopp said lighthearted, having quickly gotten over being manipulated. Now, he was trying to cheer up his niece. This job is easy and quick. And afterwards, you can play for a little bit until one of us has another chore for you. Mika looked back at her uncle and responded by sticking her tongue out at him. This is cruel and unusual punishment, she stated after. Usopp laughed before waving his hand unconcerned. Take it up with the Marines, he said as he began walking away with Frankie. I will, Mika shouted back, getting the last word in before her uncles left. Going into his 4th row, Akio looked at his friend as the deck became quiet. He was not only that surprised she was doing the job, but also the quality of the job. She sucks, he thought irritated. Mika, the boy spoke calmly. You should probably mow a bit neater than that. You don't want to have to redo this. As she mowed, the young girl looked at her friend annoyed. How can you like this? She asked sounding mad. Akio shrugged. It's not hard, he stated, and I'm used to doing chores. Mika frowned. Well, I don't do chores. You're now, Akio said before continuing to mow. He only had a few more rows to go. Seeing her friend mow, Mika looked and compared hers and Akio's work. At halfway done, Akio's work continued to look neat and orderly. On the other hand, she was barely a 4th done with her side and it looked sloppy. Jealousy grew in her mind remembering how her uncle praised the boy's work. Immediately, she began working a little more attentively, going back over the area she messed up and fixing it up. She then hurried to finish the rest of the job as Akio neared the end of his part. As he finished, Akio stopped mowing and looked over again to check on Mika. He was surprised to find that Mika was almost done, and actually doing a nice job of it. When did that happen? He thought confused. And so, eventually, Mika and Akio finished mowing the lawn. Lawn mowed. Check, good work you two on mowing, Nami said proudly as she looked over the children's handiwork. The young woman had been generally surprised to see that grass deck was cut and looking neat. She had half expected to see the lawn looking choppy and uneven, courtesy of her daughter acting out. For Akio, she expected a decent job and got a chore done well. She didn't know how or why Mika had actually done a good job, but she hoped that the same phenomenon would occur during the next chore. Now, you two can clean the dishes. Mika and Akio stood in the kitchen, the actual kitchen part of the room, before a large pile of dishes from this morning's breakfast. Though large, the dishes were not actually stacked too high. Most were placed in small columns and organized into rows stretching to nearly half the kitchen counter. Silverware up front, sans knives, followed by glasses and mugs, and finally the dishes themselves. To the kids, this looked a bit challenging. The young girl looked up to her mother nervously. Do we have to do all of it? Nami looked down at her daughter unimpressed. Your uncle Sanji does this much every day, she stated matter-of-factly. I'm sure you both together can do it as well. Don't worry, said Sanji sitting by the table with a notebook and pen nearby him. I'll help out should you two need it. Akio looked over at the man surprised. He then gave a slight bow towards the man out of respect saying to him politely, thank you. In response, Sanji shrugged though smiled in gratitude. Don't mention it, he told the boy coolly. Nami soon took her leave of the two and left the room altogether. Sanji began jotting down notes into his notebook about recipes and ideas on improving them for his crew, mostly for the female crew members. Akio had begun the dishwashing process, filling up the sink with water and soap. Akio then looked at Mika, smiling with an idea. How about you dry and I wash? Despite the reasonable suggestion, Mika looked completely uninterested in the work. Instead, she had an idea. She turned to her uncle and called out to him, "Uncle Sanji, I need help. You take the dish rag and wipe it across the object." "Mika Heim." Sanji replied in disinterest. Mika was about to say something else, but found that she had already been cut off by her uncle. Worst, he wasn't even looking at her to allow her to cute her way into him working for her. So, ever determined, Mika tried again. "Uncle Sanji, what's this?" "I know what you're trying to do, Heim," Sanji stated clearly, still not looking over at the girl. "While a good effort, I will not let myself fall for the same trick that Usopp fell for." "What?" Mika shouted in disbelief. Unable to hold back, Akio released a snicker, finding amusement in Mika's disappointment. Even if she was wasting time, he could enjoy that the girl wasn't getting her way like she expected. Unfortunately for Akio, Mika heard his soft laugh. She looked over at the boy and glared at him fiercely. Feeling the need for Vengeahe Sink, she scooped up a handful of bubbles and then blew them at Akio. The boy looked back at Mika, his face slightly covered in suds, unamused with her action. He immediately responded in turn. He dipped his hand in the water and then splashed the girl with the residue on his hand. "Huh?" Akio responded back, feeling superior. Of course, Mika did not like being one-upped. She placed her hand in the water and splashed the soap water at him. Akio hadn't expected to be splashed, but he definitely didn't like it. He of course responded back by splashing her back. Soon, both kids were splashing each other and completely forgetting their chore duty. Water and soap were spreading all over the kitchen. Obviously, their noise and splashing would attract Sanji's full attention. "Kids," he said loudly as he stopped writing in his notebook. He then stood up and rushed to stop them. "Stop that." Sanji didn't realize at first, but the floor of the kitchen was now wet with soap and water. Without conscious and proper footing, the blonde-haired man accidentally slipped as he entered. The man began falling face forward into the kitchen and, with the added hurriedness, he was propelled at the cabinets below the counter and smashed into them. Immediately, having been still in the midst of their splash war, Mika and Akio stopped when they heard the bang. They both looked back to see Sanji, face smashed against the cabinets. Instantly, they both realized it was their fault that this happened to the man. And to make matters worse, the collision with the cabinet caused a few stacks of plates to fall on top of the man. Many broke on top of him. In that moment, the kids felt all was finished. "I'm done," shouted both kids quickly. They both then took off, carefully, and left the kitchen. Meanwhile, the chef was left to ache in pain while visions of beautiful women danced around his aching head. Dishes washed, not yet. Nami had her hand on her face in frustration. She hadn't expected washing dishes would end with a quick trip to the sick bay. If it wasn't for her checking in on the kids, they probably wouldn't have found Sanji until lunch. She later found the kids in their room, playing. After dragging Mika out, with Akio following behind, Nami brought them back onto the deck. Now, she was standing before the kids as they told her their side of the story, which had turned into an argument between the two of them. Yeah huh. Stop it," Nami said loudly, causing the kids to cease their repetitive argument. With the kids quiet, Nami took a moment to calm down. "Okay, I think both of you have had enough of working together. More like working all together," Mika stated. Nami ignored her daughter's comment. "So," she said, continuing her statement, "how about you each do your own job?" Akio raised his hand looking curious. "Do we get to pick which?" he asked. "Yes," Nami said, nodding. "You have a choice of either helping Robin or finishing the dishes up." "Help Ms. Nico, Auntie," both kids said quickly. For a second time, Nami placed her hand upon her face in frustration. "For the love of," she said tiredly. Realizing that they both had asked for the same thing, the two glanced at each other and then separated. They stood opposite each other looking as if they were ready to fight. Then, they began counting down. 1, they both said together. 2, they both said as they both clenched their fist. They then raised those fists up before throwing them down. 3, the kids shouted before throwing their hands out. Both of them had their fists out. "Shoot," Akio said disappointed. "A tie." Mika stated, grinning cunningly. "This is my daddy's fist, and he can beat up anything, so I win." "What?" shouted Akio in disagreement. "This isn't rock paper scissors, Captain Luffy." "Tough," Mika said prideful before sticking her tongue out towards Akio. She then took off to help her aunt. "Hey, wait," Akio shouted, throwing his hand out to stop her. Unfortunately, she was already ahead of him. Nami released sigh before placing a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "It'll be okay, Akio. You're not going to do the dishes alone anyway. I'm going to help you." Though a little bummed, Akio did feel better. "Okay, Miss Monkey," he said, nodding in understanding. He then followed the woman back into the kitchen. Mika entered the library as she suspected that whatever help her aunt needed would probably be here. Her hunch was correct as she saw her aunt moving about in the room. She was taking books off the shelves one by one, choosing not to use her abilities. The young girl found that odd, but on the plus side she believed that this chore would be easy enough. "Hi, Auntie," Mika called out cheerfully. After taking another book down, Robin looked over towards the entrance. She smiled and greeted her young niece. "Hello Mika, are you ready to help?" "Yeah," Mika stated, grinning. "This will be easy with your devil leaf fruit powers."
I won't be using that ability today, Robin stated casually as she picked another book off the shelf.
"Huh? Why?" Robin hummed softly, smiling. Sometimes doing something slowly is relaxing. The young girl frowned. "So," she said as she looked at the shelves of books, "I just need to take the books down and open them so they may air out." Robin added as well as demonstrated, placing a book open on the table vertically. "Why? Being out on the ocean, it can become damp in rooms and it will ruin the books. Airing the books out helps them dry and stops any unsavory smells from forming." "Oh," Mika said looking generally surprised. She didn't ask any follow-up questions as she began helping Robin. The two females began working together taking and placing books all across the room. As they did so, Mika occasionally asked about certain books she found and of course, Robin was happy enough to explain each one for her. On the other hand, she herself was a little curious seeing how well-behaved Mika was appearing. From what she had heard, the young girl was being difficult. "Mika," Robin spoke up as she set some more books out to air out. Her tone remained upbeat and positive as not give away any doubt or suspicion. As she picked out another book, Mika replied back, "Yeah? I hope you're not planning anything devious like you have been with the others." Mika said as she walked over near her aunt to air out her book. She replied while doing so, "I won't, Auntie." "Oh," Robin said feigning surprise, though keeping a soft smile on. "Why not?" Mika shrugged. "I don't know." She then placed the book up and opened it to air it out. Robin knew why, which was not the point of her asking. She knew Mika tended to calm down around her, and occasionally her mother, as she more than likely looked up to her. Being the only other female in the crew not directly related to her. While she doubted Mika knew it herself, the little girl seemed to have an instinctual understanding of when and who to act out against. As most of the men would react comically and childish, Mika could do nearly anything and sometimes get away with it though not all the time. On the other hand, herself and Nami, while they could do the same but on different maturity levels, were more likely to rein the girl in and potentially reprimand her. Not like Robin ever needed to since Mika behaved well enough within her vision. Nor would she, as she believed it is the duty of her parents to apply discipline when needed. No, she had asked simply to get to the root of the girl's current problem, her frustration. Thus, she followed up with another question, "Then, why have you been so determined to act out against the others?" While surprised by the question, Mika quickly frowned with anger. She soon turned around looking away from her aunt, pouting and crossing her arms. "Because everyone else is being lazy," she stated, sounding sure of her statement. Immediately, Robin chuckled finding the little girl's statement amusing. "Is that what you think?" she asked calmly, smiling. "Yeah," Mika said stubbornly. As she approached her young niece, she bent down and placed her hand on the girl's shoulder, lightly and comforting, as she told Mika otherwise. "No one is acting lazy, we simply want you to have some responsibility around the ship." "I don't want it," Mika said, continuing to be stubborn. "Really?" Robin said amused. "Do you not understand what it means that we are giving this kind of responsibility?" From Robin's tone, Mika became suddenly interested. She turned her head to look back at her aunt, showing her expression of curiosity and intrigue yet also suspicious. Still smiling, Robin continued, "We're giving you these responsibilities because we trust you." Mika turned fully towards her aunt, now completely surprised. She remained silent, unable to think of anything to say. "As a child, we expect you to not always be by our side. We want you to be safe, but keeping you from harm won't always be enough. We want you to be able to take care of yourself if a time comes when we can no longer can or should you decide to go on your own. In a way, you doing a few chores is our way of preparing you for that. Not because we are, as you put it, lazy." "Couldn't I just learn to fight instead?" Mika asked. Instantly, Robin gave out a chuckle. "Maybe when you're older, but life skills are very important as well. Any fight that's not against someone near your own age, you should let one of the others handle it." Hearing all that, Mika frowned, feeling a bit ashamed of herself. Still though, her own feelings for the situation hadn't all been completely changed. "I still don't like chores," she told her aunt. Robin still kept her smile. "I don't expect you to like them, Mika. No one really does, but they are important for a number of reasons and we must do them. I only want you to appreciate all we have done and will do for you in future while also working hard for your own future, okay?" The young monkey D child didn't respond immediately. Mika took a moment to understand completely what her aunt told her. Again, while she still disliked the idea of chores and doing them, she understood a little of what her aunt said. Thinking about herself personally for once, she also understood that she didn't have much experience on her own. Learning how to do tasks like cooking and cleaning, while not exciting aspects for her, would be useful to her and all those she cared for. So, Mika finally responded with a nod and happy smile. "Okay." Proudly, Robin nodded and smiled back. She rubbed the child's head as well before standing up. Then, let's finish up the rest before putting them back on the shelf, she told the girl. What? Mika said shocked. We had to put them back too. Robin laughed softly as she immediately went back to work. Meanwhile, Nami and Akio were making some real headway in the dishes. Already, they had finished the glasses and mugs and nearly done cleaning the silverware. Unlike with Mika, they two's teamwork was far more functional. Nami was able to wash and rinse while Akio dried and placed the objects in their proper places, giving some to the woman when they were too high for him to reach. As they finished with the utensils, they moved on to the plates. When they began, Nami started talking with Akio. So, Nami spoke blithely while washing. I know it has been only a few days, but how are you doing? As he dried one dish, Akio responded with a shrug, fine. It's not as hard as I thought it would be. He then set the dried dish aside. It kinda feels like I'm still home. Nami looked at the boy and smiled warmly. I'm happy to hear that, she told the Akio. All these chores, they're kinda like what I did back home for mom. Nami smiled fondly. Yuka raised a very good boy. She commented contently before her mood soured slightly in thinking of her own child. Unlike some little girl of mine. Honestly, Miss Monkey, I still don't like doing chores any more than the next kid, though Akio said that. He soon realized a slight difficulty in that statement. He gave out a nervous chuckle as he then stated, well, unless that kid is Mika, she's pretty bratty. Yeah, she is. Nami stated, agreeing without a hint of regret. Then, she gave the boy a light punch to the top of his head. Ow, only I get to call my daughter a brat. Nami stated almost darkly, if I hear you say anything bad about my daughter again, I'll fine you 1,000,000 Baileys for every word you say against her, got it? A little scared now, Akio nodded profusely. Yes, ma'am, he said quickly. Upon hearing, Nami's mood lightened back to cheerful. Good, she said content before getting back to washing. She's scarier than the sword guy, Akio thought in silence as he got to drying dishes. After some time, both Mika and Akio finished with their chosen, or forced in Akio's case, chore. Once finished, both child and adult walked outside where most of the crew was also situated. When they all got there, the men seemed to be having a good laugh at the expense of one of their own. Shut up, you shitty bastards, shouted Sanji angrily. His head was slightly wrapped up, an indication from his embarrassing fall in the kitchen. None of the men paid any mind to the man's shout. Especially not Usopp, as he began acting out the scene. Here I come, Usopp said with his best Sanji impression. He then feigned tripping and falling shouted out, oops. The long-nosed man then pretended to crash into the wall. Instantly, all the men laughed, especially Zoro. It's just as stupid as I imagined him to be, he stated mockingly. Instantly, by combination of both Zoro and the group's mockery, Sanji was enraged by his crewmates. So much so that fire seemed envelop his body, figuratively speaking. That's it, he shouted, I'm gonna fillet the whole lot of you. Having heard enough, Nami intervened. Ahem, she said loudly, making sure to grab the men's attention. All the men stopped laughing and Sanji ceased his fiery fury. They turned around to see Nami, not looking happy, along with the children and Robin. The orange-haired woman then asked, so, are we done being jerks? All the men went silent and nodded. Sanji, while doing the same, also calmed down and spoke to the navigator. Yes, sorry Nami, we. As he spoke, the woman suddenly grabbed his ear and pulled his in punishment. Ow, 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 ow. I heard you curse, Nami stated businesswoman-like, pay up. Though in pain, Sanji quickly pulled out a few belly bills and gave them to Nami. Of course, he told the woman apologetically. Nami accepted the money. Once she pocketed it and released Sanji from her grip, she then looked sternly at the rest of the crew. Don't think you guys are out of the woods, you're all helping with this next chore. What? Shouted the men, except for Sanji. Mika ran behind her mother and preformed Akanbe, the tongue sticking out and eyelid pulled down mockery action, mocking the men. Nah, she said jeeringly. You aren't free from this chore either, Nami quickly stated to her daughter. Quickly, Mika lost her boastfulness. Aw, man, she said disappointed. Curious, Chopper spoke up. What is the chore, Nami? Cleaning the decks. A collective groan came from only the most immature of the group. Luffy, Usopp, Chopper, Mika, and Akio. The others were more or less indifferent to the chore. Everyone was soon readied with equipment to begin. Mops for some, brush brooms for others, and a few drying rags for the youngest of the group. They were to soon begin, but then Mika had come up with an idea. She immediately told her mother her idea, and the woman found it interesting. Okay, Nami told her daughter with a smile. We'll try it your way. Mika responded with a happy grin, becoming giddy with anticipation. She then watched as her mother set her brush broom and pulled out her perfect clean attack. Cool ball, Nami shouted out as she began producing balls of cooled air into the sky. The rest of the group heard Nami. Curious, Brooke was the first to ask, Miss Nami, whatever are you doing? We're gonna clean the fun way, Mika said so for her mother could. This immediately got everyone's attention. The fun way? Repeated most of the group, sounding confused. On the other hand, Robin clearly understood what was going on. Very creative, Mika, she said, complimenting her niece. Instantly, Mika giggled with joy and accomplishment. She. Akio though was still confused. But what is Miss Monkey doing? He said before he looked up into the sky. As he watched, he saw a cloud began forming and growing bigger. Whoa, the boy said, amazed. You haven't seen anything yet, Nami told the boy as she continued feeding more cool balls into the cloud. Soon, the cloud was so large that it covered the entire thousand sunny and shade. She then stopped, noticing it was the right size. Now, rain tempo. As if on cue, the cloud began pouring down rain upon the ship. The rain itself was rather light enough that it would only be a small nuisance to work in. In some regard, it was also refreshing. Of course, it wouldn't last long, so the crew needed to work fast. Let's get cleaning, everyone, Nami shouted out as she exchanged her clean attack for the scrubbing broom. Yeah, shouted the whole crew in response. Everyone quickly got to work. Since the decks were all ready and continuing to be wet, all the crew really had to do is place an appropriate amount of soap and clean. This would be easy for most, but for those who like to have fun it meant much more. Yo-ho-ho-ho, laughed out Brook as he quickly skated on the deck, with scrubbing brushes on his feet and light frame making his movement incredibly fast. As the skeleton skated, he created a large amount of bubbles in a quick amount of time, as big as a large mound. Once the musician was done, Usopp charged on through the bubbles with Mika standing on his broom. Both of them laughed out as they saw each other covered in soap bubbles. Mika soon shouted out in joy, again. You go it, Usopp said happily. Zoro, with 2 mops in his hands and 1 in his mouth, held his mops in a familiar sword stance. He then flew across the deck spinning as he performed one of his sword techniques, only altering it slightly. 3 mop technique, Hio Kindama. In his wake, there formed almost a tunnel of bubbles. Leopard spinning balls, shot. Having watched this while sitting on the railing, Akio was amazed by the technique, even if it was only a washing variant. So cool, he shouted. Next, it was Robin's turn. She crossed her arms and closed her eyes as she began focusing on the task at hand. Bean to fleur, scrub, she said as 20 of her arms and hands sprouted across the deck. Each hand then grabbed a cloth and passed it on to the other before beginning to scrub the deck. All the crew was cleaning the deck in whatever way they could think of. Or in many cases, in any way Mika could think of. Everyone was enjoying this task and having fun, even while in the rain. Indeed, it was still raining. As the crew had their fun, cleaning and producing an enormous amount of suds, the rain helped in washing away all the soap and dirt from the deck. By the time the cloud had used up all its collected moisture and dissipated, the entirety of the outside decks had been scrubbed and clean, giving off a sheen like it was brand new again. Phew, Usopp said, releasing an exhausted sigh as he sat down on the grass deck, though very much content and smiling. That was fun. Grinning happily, Akio nodded in agreement. Yeah. Not only that, Chopper stated before patting the grass deck, we also got to water all the plants too. Indeed. Brook said happily. 2 chores done in one fell swoop. Mika-chan sure is a creative one. He then gave out a laugh in joy. Yo-ho-ho-ho. Chuckling and grinning proudly, Luffy patted his daughter's head as they both sat near each other. Good job, Mika, he said to her cheerfully. Yeah, good job, lil sis, Frankie said as well, giving the girl a thumb up. Brimming with happiness from receiving so much support, Mika giggled and blushed while appreciating her family more. She soon felt another hand. Still standing, Sanji looked up towards the sky, making an observational judgment. Seems like noon. The man commented towards himself. He then turned to the crew and told them with a smile, how about we break for lunch now? Yeah, shouted most of the crew. Though not vocal, Robin happily agreed with a curt nod. Zoro though gave out a mocking smirk. Just don't slip when you bring it out, he stated to the cook shamelessly. Immediately, this set Sanji off. Shut up, stupid mosshead, he shouted enraged. Just for that, you can starve. What? Shouted Zoro shocked. Don't worry, Sanji stated oddly calm. Being a plant head you can just absorb all the nutrients that the sun and water gives you. Why you? Zoro said, steaming mad, even about to draw his sword out. Watching on, Akio soon asked his sitting neighbor, do they always act like this? His neighbor, Usopp, replied back with wry shrug, about once a day, yeah. Go cook lunch, you dartboard brow, huh? You wanna fight, lost child? Zoro stood up with his sword partially drawn out. Bring it on, idiot cook. Just as they both were about to exchange blows, mostly non-lethal, there came a shout. Stop fighting, Mika shouted loudly. Her shout had surprised everyone, even making Zoro and Sanji stop instantly oddly. With everyone's attention on her, Mika then made an angry declaration to the 2 men. No more fighting, I don't like it when you fight each other, make up now. Everyone was rather shocked by Mika's sudden statement, But if Usopp's earlier statement had been an indicator of anything, it was this had been coming from a long time. The young girl, though often attempting to trick and play with her family, never liked to see them fight against each other. It was odd, in that Zoro and Sanji had always done so throughout their journey together. It could be that the young girl, who may not totally understand their bond, felt that a situation could come forth and one of them would leave. A tale she had been familiar with thanks to stories from her parents about their adventures before her birth. Even if she hadn't been there during her father and her uncle Usopp's fight, just hearing and even seeing how her parents felt, she didn't like it one bit. For both men, they suddenly felt ashamed of themselves. In truth, they probably wouldn't have to fight or argue, but they did as neither wanted to feel lesser than the other, which in turn made them grow slightly. But for a child, still so new to the world, it would probably set a bad example for her. So, they both quickly calmed down. Zoro was then the first, after putting his sword back, to give out his hand in apology. "Sorry," he said curtly. "No," Sanji said as he accepted the hand, "I'm sorry." Ironically, this just annoyed the swordsman. "No, I'm the one going to apologize," he said stubbornly. Equally, Sanji also started becoming more stubborn. "Why do you have to be the bigger man? I'll be the one apologizing." "No, I will. I will, Mosshead. I will, Dark Bro." "You wanna fight?" They both shouted at the same time, which only made things worse. "Hey, quit copying me." Then, immediately, two sandals hit both of their heads, instantly stopping them from going on. "Stop it," Mika shouted bossily, now missing a pair of sandals on her feet. Nami, for a third time today, placed her hand onto her face, feeling exhausted. "Those two," she said to herself in frustration. "Sanji," whined Luffy looking hungry. "Food, now." All right, Sanji said calmly before he and Zoro separated. He then immediately walked to the kitchen. Robin chuckled before speaking to the girl. "Nice try, Mika, but some men just like to butt egos with each other." Still frustrated from earlier, Mika nodded and crossed her arms. "Boys are dumb," she stated confidently. "Hey," Akio shouted, taking immediate offense to that statement. Everyone then shared a laugh, except for Zoro, who just looked annoyed. Kids can be mysterious creatures, sometimes then become bratty another. Some have an amazing amount of energy, out of control or otherwise, and some act more mature than most their age. They are creative beings, yet also very lazy ones too. They don't always know what's happening around them, or maybe they know far more than they let on. Kids can be brats and angels, little monsters and great helpers, and completely selfish and amazingly insightful all in one day. Sometimes emotional, uncontrolled with themselves, yet can pick up on anyone else's problems. But the most important thing to understand about any child is that you should never underestimate them.